Our first presentation will be from Adam Rothstein and Rosalynn Rothstein, who very unfortunately had an emergency that called them. They were already in Buffalo and they were called back to Portland. And so they will be joining us, Skype willing.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening to us remotely since we were called back to Portland. So we're going to talk about some work that we've done on occupying media space. So I guess we'll start by talking about the purposes we identified of occupying media space, specifically related to our experience with Occupy Portland. So there's the first thing we've identified, which is for internal communication among activists, generally we'll call communication. So that's our first purpose for occupying media space. And that includes secure person-to-person communication, secure person-to-group communication, tactical mapping, reconnaissance, evidence collection, counter-surveillance, and physical self-defense. And the tools of this are email, websites, variety of websites, cell phones, other broadcast mediums, sound amplification, leaflets, and posters. Our second category is for self-directed legwork of the Occupy camps and activism, generally called organization. So this includes instant message, radios, phones, email, documents, a variety of sorts, wikis, video chat, conference calls, and crowdfunding services. And then the third, which is for external communication and PR, which is generally called media, which includes video broadcast, photo broadcast, social media, blogs, websites, etc.
So what we're saying here is that while these goals of organization, outward media, and communication all seem very simple and straightforward, they're actually really complex, and there's a lot of tools involved. And using all these tools presents their own problems, and there's all kinds of hang-ups more that when the activity becomes more complicated than simple communication. Communication sounds really easy, but then in actuality, it's more difficult. These are some photos from Occupy Portland. As you can see, these photos are pretty blurry and hard to make out. These are taken with a fairly good camera, but show some difficulties of night photography, which is one sort of technological difficulty that we ran into a lot. A lot of times cameras would be present for the purpose of documentation, and also in cases of police brutality. Oh, did we lose your image? Okay. So in cases of police brutality, it would be important to try and document what was going on. But as you can see, that's difficult when everything's blurry and you can barely even make out faces, let alone badge numbers or anything like that. So there you can see they've got camera here on the pole. That's them filming as we are filming as well. Here's some of the technology that we used in the camps themselves. We've got the information booth here. Here's a picture of the media tent. As you can see, a lot of the laptops going on. There was Wi-Fi, generators, and stuff like that. So we had that as a challenge to begin with. We had some pretty good camera equipment out there, some amateur people and professional people with pretty good equipment, and that was always helpful. There's some self-defense media right there. But most of the time, things were filmed with cell phones, and that just doesn't work very well. Cell phones don't take very good pictures at night. They take low res. They don't have a very high ISO rate, so they are often insufficient. One of the coolest things that we did was we had a mobile media van, which is the little blue vehicle here in the foreground. And here was our bat signal, which was a projector that was throwing up images onto nearby buildings as a way of communicating and doing sort of propaganda activities. So here's some screenshots. Here's a typical Google Doc of us trying to coordinate. Here's what Ustream looks like, which was the main way of video broadcasting from the scene. As you can see here, it's the image is very small and not very good quality, and it's surrounded by ads here. This was a pretty funny ad that came up during when I was taking the screenshot. Twitter, of course, was also useful, but as anybody who's ever tried to follow a hashtag knows, that things can get pretty cluttered fairly quickly. Storify was kind of one of the better tools that we used because it allowed us to edit and curate the social media that was reposted to get the best stuff. And then, of course, we had websites as well. And this was the media website that I worked on with some other folks out of Portland. Oh, it looks like we've lost the image again.
So I guess now we're going to talk about, those are some examples, which hopefully you were able to see some of them, but now we're going to talk about some of the conclusions that we've been able to draw based on this use of media. So the first one would be that when we use for-profit tools developed by a company, we're adopting their monetized use cases. So the tools are, each of these variety of tools we've discussed are designed by a for-profit company in many cases and for a use case that they've identified as potentially profitable. So these use cases vary. Some, like sending SMS messages from a mobile phone, very close to the tactical goal of person-to-person communication that developed during Occupy, albeit with a single important failure that they're quite insecure. Others, like Facebook, are primarily designed to monetize interpersonal relationships by harvesting personal data and serving ads. So while Facebook can be used for media or communication purposes, it's really not designed for doing so.
I think Ustream is probably the best, one of the good examples of that it seems like live video broadcast would be a really powerful tool, but it wasn't always designed for what activists were using. So another potential problem is that when we continue using tools previously adopted in an old media space, we're failing to adapt totally to the new media space. So we think it's clever and apt when we can use a tool for a purpose other than it was designed for. But often it's simply inconvenient. By using
It's often simply convenient.
yeah, it's awfully simply convenient, and it isn't quite as clever as we like to think it is. By using an insecure phone line for a tactical call, for example, we reduce the capacity of that call to mere conversation, which anyone could overhear. And this was sort of a back and forth issue in Occupy, whether it was more important to emphasize transparency and not worry about security, but this could also be a hazard at times.
So the third, when we pick up tools based on what we see being used by others, we're copying their decisions rather than properly reacting to the space. So Facebook seems to be useful because its widespread adoption stands in for its actual design efficacy. In other words, it doesn't work very well, but lots of people use it, so it seems like it works okay. When live streams adopted as a media reporting because others are using it, or a hashtag is adopted because others are using it, we're creating a digital mob, not a protest.
And we settle for a less than perfect tool. We're settling for a less than perfect tactic when that tactic is media, or when it's protest. We often choose something because it seems to work and we go ahead with it. But the movement in Occupy quickly shifted from a spontaneous idea to a serious tactical battle. The state increased quickly. People were seriously hurt from being otherwise unprepared and utilizing half measures. Not only individually dangerous, but led to the movement eventually sort of petering out. When you have these conflicts time and time again, when there's police brutality and you're unable to do anything about it, then eventually it's sapped strength.
And the fifth, without detailed technical knowledge, we're all othered by a new media space. Anyone who's not fluent in a particular technology is immediately at a disadvantage. If in a media space, the right technological narrative is the difference between safety and harm, the wrong technological narrative can make a person a target. Attempting to use a supposedly secure form of communication without understanding what that means put a person at more risk.
So the choices we make are not always rational choices about what's available, convenient in terms of technology, but it's also about our own personal narrative of what we think we're doing. A movement or any other activity is only as serious as it takes itself, and decisions are based upon what the goal is perceived and described to be. If the stakes are not viewed as high, they will be treated less vitally. So for example, when we see like a cell phone photo going around that seems to have political import, then we tend to think that cell phone photos will always have political import, even though often they're technologically insufficient.
So I guess at this point, these conclusions in our discussion of some of the problems of the media that was used during the Occupy movement come from Adam's experience working with Occupy Portland and working with the Occupier, which was a media outlet for Occupy Portland, and then also including some of our perspectives from journalism and then also from academic perspectives, specifically that I'm a folklorist. So we, in the end, started thinking about this as a creation of narrative and how folklorists look at narratives. So political narratives for our purposes are the continuum of how we describe our own actions in the strategic media space. This encompasses personal experience narratives and extends to larger, more coherent narratives structured by intentional group expression. The expression of political narratives in Occupy extended across multiple technological platforms, verbal communication, and other modes, essentially becoming a multimodal form of communication. So narratives were fragmented from the beginning, and yet there was unity within the common strategic media space. For example, the common media space reflected the movement's concerns with accurately representing itself in the face of mass media's failure to do so. And yet there were serious divisions of that strategic media space. A fragmented political narrative is not problematic in itself, but in the case of Occupy, the narrative was not fragmented, but in some cases woefully non-existent because of the tools being utilized. Demands may not be necessary, but an accurate portrayal of the tasks to be accomplished and the means for accomplishing them are. So do you want to go ahead for that?
Yeah, sure. So for the Occupy movement, the technological platforms and media space in which narratives were deployed were not always well understood. There were a lot of people jumping into this and using these tools for the first time. And that was good because a lot of people learned things very quickly, but it didn't always do as good a job as it could have done. It was assumed that, like the fragmented political narratives that came together to form the strategic media space of what Occupy was from all these different political sources this movement developed. So it was believed that the needs of the tactical media space would simply be spontaneously solved in the same way. But the default behaviors we identified previously hid within the tactical substructure, growing into serious flaws. This emphasis on verbal narration found its form in the emphasis on social media in Occupy. The design of many technological platforms, the social media platforms used by the Occupy movement, are oriented to the user's personal expression, not about creating an explicit political narrative. While the platforms allowed, as designed, a reasonable format for strategic expression, this expression neglected the need to formulate political narratives more appropriate to the tactical media space. So, in other words, people were able to express themselves, but in terms of organizing a movement, social media was very much lacking in that regard. So, I think that's just about. How are we doing on time?
We'll keep you online as long as our Wi-Fi is nice to us for discussion later. Our next presenter will be Paige Sarlin. Paige is a professor of media study here at the University at Buffalo.
Thanks, Jordan. I'm really excited to be here and be part of this panel. And I think this paper follows pretty interestingly after the last one. So I want to start with a quotation from Jodi Dean, an important critic and theorist of the internet, social media, and Occupy Wall Street. She wrote in her most recently published book, The Communist Horizon, occupation is best understood as a political form for the incompatibility, the irreducible gap between capitalism and the people. To conceive Occupy as a political form is to think of it as a configuration of opposition within a particular social historical setting. To call Occupy a political form of the incompatibility between capitalism and the people is to say that it has a specific and fundamental content, and that this content consists in the concentration of intensities around the gap of capitalism's failure as an economic system adequate to the capacities, needs, demands, and general will of the people. I begin my analysis of the real-time documentary media of OWS with Dean's conception of the significance of Occupy to underscore the political basis of my understanding of Occupy. Her emphasis on historical specificity provides an important perspective that helps to frame the significance of the deployment of real-time media in the context of contemporary capitalism, dependent as it is on communication technology, both structured by and structuring of the media architecture that shapes our lives and our imaginaries. Her focus on this gap of desire, articulated and opened up by the development of Occupy, provides a lens through which to consider the role of various forms of media in the operations and development of Occupy, and most crucially for my purposes in this paper, to consider the role of media in the construction and the representation of a perpetual now, a particular relation to historical time. For Dean, this gap named by Occupy relates to the tensions and inadequacies of various representations of the movement, and it is towards the temporal character of these tensions that my paper focuses, both in terms of an analysis of the symptomatic importance given to the deployment of live stream and the need for more consideration of the production and circulation of quickly edited documentary videos that sought to describe, explain, document, and mobilize. Now, I had to cut a lot of the analysis of live stream, which I'm sure I actually find more interesting in some ways, but I wanted to show you two videos that are of this sort of the quickly edited, uploaded documentary, because I find them very symptomatic in different ways. So, to a great degree, it is crucial to a critique of the function of media in Occupy to assess the adequacy of the technology and platforms to their political tasks, to the maintenance, promotion, development, and representation of the movement. But I also think it's important to see the ways in which these failures point to political and ideological dynamics, both in terms of the very status of social media within narratives about Occupy Wall Street and the opportunity they afford us to examine the political strengths and weaknesses of the movement itself. With this in mind, this paper tries to think through assertions of novelty as misleading, politically suggestive, and symptomatic, because it is the case that all of these tools and practices have movement histories, right, that precede Occupy, something which Sasha Costanza-Chalk has recently described in detail. But I'll go back to a little bit of media history. Chris Marker's documentary film from 1991, Grin Without a Cat, offers an analysis of the role of media images within social movements from the 1960s. One of the central insights of Marker's film concerns the appearance of the state in documentation of clashes between protesters in the streets of Paris, between police and protesters. Offering one of the first criticisms of what has come to be called protest porn, Marker's film demonstrates the persistence of the logic of the spectacle in the circulation of images of social movements, a logic that enables the misrecognition of political efficacy in the face of state violence. But it also underscores the necessity for a nuanced analysis of the role of media within the construction and development of social movements, an analysis that derives from a physical and temporal distance from events, a historical remove. In the case of the media of Occupy Wall Street, I'm engaging in a similar process of analysis and assessment, as we all are, right? But I also want to call attention to the significance of the different qualities of time, the difference between real-time tweets, updates, and live streams, and the processing of media, the transformation of rushes, footage, images, and video into edited formats that were uploaded to Vimeo, YouTube, and shared on Facebook. Produced within the time frame of Occupy, these videos represent a different, and I hasten sort of say older mode of media production that relies on montage and the incorporation of some aspects of retrospective reflection, and a more explicit practice of representation, the construction of narrative, however fragmented, multiple, and open, in which the participants within the movement work to represent themselves. These DIY productions were produced explicitly to circulate images and descriptions in the absence of mainstream media, to demonstrate the political form of the occupation and to articulate the importance of something quite different than the spectacle of police clashes and protest porn, referred to as promotional videos by Ernie Larson and Sherry Milner, two seasoned activist filmmakers. These videos were made and uploaded as quickly as possible. The speed was enabled by new technologies, but the decision to compile the range of voices rising up in protest and opposition and frame the social activity within the park, the prefigurative aspects of the communal experience of collective self-activity, the organization of the means of daily reproduction, of food, shelter, healthcare, education, counseling, art, and culture were political assertions, attempts to agitate and demonstrate the openness of the formation, the necessity for and novelty of the movement, and in this way they maintain their political relevance. So one of the most striking examples, of a promotional video is "Nobody Can Predict the Moment of Revolution." Ooh, okay. By Eva Radivojevich and Martina Sarosta. In their description of their video, they offer a gloss to the film. We want to share insights into the formation of a new social movement as it is still taking shape in real time. This video was shot during the 5th and 6th day of the occupation. The idea to occupy the financial district in New York City was inspired by recent uprisings in Spain, Greece, Egypt, and Tunisia, which most of us were following online. Despite the corporate media's effort to silence the protest and Yahoo's attempt to censor it in email communication, the occupation is growing in numbers and spreading to other cities in the US and abroad. Please forward our video to like-minded people via email, Facebook, Twitter, and make the voices of dissent circulate. Okay, so I'm just going to show the intro of this. It's 8 minutes long.
I see corporatism, fascism, crony capitalism. I don't see a free market. I see a police state. I see an American empire. I see 700 military bases in 135 foreign countries. I see 5,000 dead bodies in Iraq, a welfare warfare state which gives out billions of dollars in foreign aid for dictators to build up huge armies. I see America that's lost its way. Republicans and Democrats, who both pretty much stand for the same thing. I do not see true democracy. I do not hear the voice of the people. Finally, we've risen up.
Spain, Egypt, is the dynamics, is the time right? Is it the right moment? Is the zeitgeist there? None of these things we can predict.
Hey, sir.
We've seen what happens when people protest and come out and march around for a day. This is an opportunity maybe for a new style, for a new shift in power and the way that people relate to each other. And, like I say, I think we're fucked either way, but it's worth a shot.
I was waiting for this to happen. I knew it would happen because...
Okay, so this kind of demonstrates some of what was just talked about in terms of voices and the collection of them. But one of the things that happens in this is the kind of is the consistent assertion of the novelty of what people are doing, and then we get to a kind of interesting thing about what that is. The first half is sort of an articulation of an argument of why, and then this is sort of what happens with the what.
Masses to the obstruction of justice that has been a part of our lives for too long now, for too long of a time.
so close together, especially in a city like this, you know, and everybody's sort of scared to make that first step, to break through those walls that people put up, to make the connections necessary to build a community like this or different that talks about problems. And we all have common problems, common things that we can change to make our lives better.
I'm a 60-year-old Vietnam era vet.
Let me just get to the one. Sorry. Okay, so here's where.
If you're frustrated, if you're like me and you see the Tea Party on television and in the news all the time, and you wonder why the hell isn't there a radical left answer to the Tea Party, you should be here. If you have a ton of student debt like me, you should be here. If you're pissed off and you realize that if you paid any taxes last year, you paid more taxes than General Electric, the corporation, you should be here.
There's also a whole lineup of interviews with folks who are really articulating. What happens is that you see the unevenness of the political training of the people in these, so you see people who are articulating really wildly like what the ideals are and the kind of aspiration of Occupy, and then you see people who are very new to activism articulating this, and that unevenness kind of represents itself as this inviting kind of space of come join us, add your voices. The fact of the matter is that, no one's named, and what I'm trying to get to is that this becomes an extremely symptomatic video because it's the day before the first police arrests, and there's a kind of excitement about it. But within it, there are all these little threads of the kinds of political schisms, and namely the kind of celebration of horizontality and leaderlessness that in fact what you see in this video is a whole lineup of unnamed leaders. So people who became really significant in the sort of taking on unnamed leadership roles in Occupy. And I find it really interesting that right away we have one of these documents that does that, right? That just sort of picks that, and the people who are become really kind of de facto leaders are in fact represented. But I guess the last point I just want to make is what seems crucial to me is that these narratives stand as indicators and documents of the deployment of media for promotion, an assertion of the significance of occupation as a political form, and in so doing we see and analyze, we get to see and analyze the construction of presence crucial to prefigurative politics and a celebration of spontaneity, which is in fact quite misleading. So we also see a representation that points to that which exceeds the frame, which is precisely the distance between the aspirations and the articulation of the recognition of inequality, the need for new structures and systems. And so in that way, there's a kind of political argument that we can even see from now, like from the perspective of today, that resonated with vast numbers of people worldwide. So that's it.
Okay, I'll get you a clicker, but first I'll introduce. Welcome Jonathan Massey from Syracuse University. Oh, on behalf of Jonathan Massey and Brett Snyder of UC Davis.
Hello, MediaCities 4. I have to convey, first of all, the regrets of my co-author, Brett Snyder from University of California, Davis, who between his faculty obligations there and his presentation tomorrow in New York of one of the finalist entries in the Reinventing the Payphone competition, couldn't swing a trip to Buffalo. We decided since there are two of us, we might not risk the Skyping, and so I'm going to present work that we did together with some support from student assistants at Syracuse University back in fall 2011 and early 2012. In addition to the text we submitted for the conference proceedings, the background of this paper is research that was published in Places, the journal at designobserver.com on the one-year anniversary of the beginning of Occupy Wall Street, and we have about 8,000 to 10,000 words of analysis no, okay, something like a 10,000 word pair of articles on Design Observer that will give you a deeper picture of the work we did, if you still have the appetite for more after my short presentation. So what I'm presenting today on behalf of Brett as well is some of the ideas we developed about the changing relationships between spaces, publics, and polities as we followed the activities of Occupy Wall Street in New York and also in various of the fragmented media spaces that we heard about in the first presentation today. And so our title is Crowdmapping Translocal Publics. I should issue a caveat. We are architects, and so we're not media theorists. This is, in a sense, us grappling with and trying to find concepts from the scholarly literature that could help us make sense of the phenomena we observed. Our initial interest in Occupy Wall Street was partly documentary. We set out, first of all, to try to understand the camp that sprang up in Zuccotti Park and to map it, to document it for posterity, because so often in emergent and ephemeral phenomena like this, the precise patterns of the spatialization of social life and political discourse are not recorded, and they can be very elusive to reconstruct. As an architectural historian, I'm frequently grappling with impoverished sources as I try to understand festivals and pageants and protests and marches and camps in history. So we set out to Zuccotti Park, and Liberty Plaza, the camp that sprang up there. And so we started by surveying the park and drawing it and creating a series of documents of the physical infrastructure of the camp, the underlying landscape of Zuccotti Park, overlaid with umbrellas and crates and buckets and mops and brooms and shelves that served as an impromptu pantry for the kitchen to kind of map the installation of occupier material and also then of police barricades and vehicles and surveillance towers and food trucks and other framing installations that were part of the camp. We spent a Saturday morning with some helpers doing a kind of survey of the position of bodies in the park, a kind of snapshot view pretty early on a Saturday morning when it was not at maximum capacity, where we did our body count and we tried to capture were people standing, sitting, or lying down. We looked at the concentration of particular activities that emerged as the camp became functionally and programmatically zoned. And then later on reflected a little bit on the kind of gradients from brain work to body work, from whiter to more multi-ethnic, from more often talking to more often sleeping, the kind of gradients and topographies, sociological, spatial, and discursive, that emerged in the camp. And then we also tracked as it became more spatially subdivided with the onset of winter weather and the hotly contested and debated emergence of tents and canopies at multiple scales. You can read about that stuff in our Design Observer article. And then we also, of course, documented the clearing of the park in November 2011. What led us into the media dimension of our analysis was looking through the lens of affordances. So we wrote quite a bit about how the position of a bench, the height of a retaining wall, the underlying topography of property ownership, the infrastructure of power and water, and in particular the environmental factors like noise and dust from the World Trade Center construction, solar exposure, prevailing wind directions, the primacy of Broadway relative to Trinity Place and other streets. The way these underlying affordances were the small initial triggers that led to significant sociological and functional striations within a camp that ideally wanted to remain less hierarchically organized. That led us to observe that the performance of staging a public and forming a polity, a political entity in Zuccotti Park was only part of the picture, that public and that polity was performing a kind of foundational dream of Western democracy, which is that the polity is a group of citizens gathered together in the central public space of a city. But that simultaneously, that the forums, the conversations, the spaces were hybrid, and they were mediated across the spectrum of media that the Rothsteins very ably and expertly describe in their paper and in their talk. And so minutes of General Assemblies were live transcribed by an army of laptoppers into Google Docs. They were posted to the blog. The Twitter was a medium for real-time feedback between people in the park and people elsewhere. Of course, meetings held in the atrium at 60 Wall Street and in Zuccotti Park were complemented by online discussion groups and forums, and decisions, such as the decisions about tents when the weather turned colder, were conducted. Those debates happened in an asynchronous set of in-person and also online conversations that only partially overlapped. In fact, the deliberation that was so foregrounded in General Assemblies was prefigured in a week form with things like this Facebook poll from the summer prior to the occupation, as people began to form a polity even in the privately owned public space of Facebook before they were able to stage it in the privately owned public space of Zuccotti Park. So we were very interested, and in the second half of my presentation, I will walk through some of the ways we came to understand those relationships between spaces, publics, and polities, looking also at things like the 99% project on Tumblr. We did some crude efforts at tracking activity in different media spaces. This is a glimpse of the timeline we made, and understanding that our data sets were super sketchy and our statistical analysis capabilities very limited. But this was an attempt to try to understand how conversations in different media were interacting with events in the park. We became quite interested in crowd maps as an organizational device. These built off of Ushahidi, open source crowd mapping software, became one of the ways that the movement represented itself. And so crowd maps on this main Occupy Wall Street site, but also on other sites, also from the Acampada movement, like this site, Take the Square, became one of the ways that the movement represented itself and framed conversations and also archiving of information. The most robust of these crowd maps was the Occupy map at map.occupy.net, which not only allowed people to post through a web interface, but also auto-harvested tweets and other online activity. If you used particular hashtags, the Occupy map would auto-populate with your tweet, and through TwitPic and Telly and TwitVid, it had a kind of multimedia geo-referenced auto-populating function, so that activities in New York and around the world started to populate this crowd map. That led us to understand that Occupy Wall Street didn't necessarily succeed at doing this, but it pointed the way toward a practice of big data from below, a kind of inversion of the usual relationship that we have with big data sets used in real estate development and municipal governance. So consider the case of 702 Vermont Street, a nondescript two-story house on a long block of East New York in Brooklyn. This is a house that you would drive right by on the way to the supermarket or the public school without particularly noticing. But if you look for it on Trulia or Zillow, you can find deep data about the real estate history, valuation, and many attributes of the house and its property and the market for it. If you look at NYC GIS, New York City's public GIS database, you can again find very deep information, not only on 702 Vermont, marked in red, but also on any property in New York City. this is the neighborhood as it looks to Zillow. We're used to interacting with these big data sets that are generated by corporations and the state. Occupy Wall Street created its own big, I don't know, big might be an overstatement, created its own growing crowdsourced geodata set with the Occupy map. And so if you look for 702 Vermont Street on the Occupy map, you'll discover that it was a hot spot of Occupy Our Homes, the anti-foreclosure dimension of the Occupy movement. And in December, a month after the camp had been shut down, occupiers were mobilizing in part through the crowd map to protest foreclosure, threatened foreclosure on 702 Vermont Street. And so you can see, occupiers reclaiming the house with a candle as a symbol of housewarming. You can see video and photographs from a march and a rally. You can see the bat signal projected on a nearby, the side of a nearby house. So the quick review of concepts that are developed at slightly greater length in the paper. Surveillance, what Patrick Meyer from Ushahidi describes as a counterpoint to surveillance, a kind of look back at the state from below or at the corporations that these open data online spaces permit. We thought also about aggregation logics. Sociologists looking at Occupy camps observed that in addition to the network logics of Occupy mobilizing pre-existing networks of political activists, there was a powerful phenomenon of aggregation of previously unrelated individuals who learned through these different media or participated through these multiple social media and came together in city parks and online in unprecedented configurations, captured for me, evoked visually by this kind of imagery from crowd maps of the movement. Neogeography is Andrew Turner's term for the cobbled together DIY assembly of off-the-shelf tools to do geographical work, even if you lack deep experience in cartography and other forms of map making. So we were very struck at the way occupiers produced cartographic instruments using open source software and often off-the-shelf components in order to depict social topographies that were otherwise invisible. Chris Kelty's concept of recursive publics came out of the open software scholarship, but it seemed like a good way of describing Occupy itself, a public that is vital, that focuses on sustaining itself as a public. In some ways, I would say the line-by-line political ambitions of the Occupy movement were less meaningful, certainly to me, than the project of constructing a polity of a kind that didn't exist before, of creating the spaces for new publics to form and have a new set of conversations about how we govern ourselves. And so, in a sense, if we look at the interaction among these different publics and media spaces, we can understand the camp in Zuccotti Park using Manuel Castell's term of wicket camps, that they were assembled in a relatively loose coalition of forces using information, ideas, and concepts sourced in a way that Saskia Sassen talks about as translocal relationships. That the occupiers in Zuccotti Park had a closer relationship to acampada campers in Barcelona, Madrid, Chiapas, and elsewhere than they did to other networks of similar groups within New York City and state, let's say. And so there's a kind of translocal geography among these Wicca camps around the world. That's the concluding concept that I wanted to leave you with, except that as a historian I have to add one other thing. Two occupiers proposed, they were concerned that the records of the camp and the movement would be consolidated at even a very progressive institution like NYU's Special Collections Division, which has a deep labor movement history. And they pointed out that the archive has a politics of access and control that is exceedingly hierarchical and is antithetical to the principles of Occupy. And so they called for the creation of anarchives, open spaces of memory, documentation, and recollection. And it seems to Brett and me that these crowd maps are one such space. Thank you very much.
So we have some time, a few minutes for some discussion. And I'd like to start us off with just an observation and a question, and then I'll try and keep my eye out for the audience behind the podium and open it up for a little bit of conversation between all of you and questions from the audience. So the first kind of observation that I'd like to put out is that if we're devoting ourselves to questions of different kinds of globalities and pluralities, that this first panel looking at, why thank you, looking at different appearances of Occupy and of what we're calling uncommon occupations is already presenting a first set of pluralities, and indeed a kind of recursive loop between them. Not only the pluralities of place, of different occupies, whether we're looking at New York or Portland, but also about this relationship between different cities, different media, including notions of the documentary, that word came up several times, and of different times. In Paige's talk, for instance, this idea of the perpetual now in real time versus processed media, which in turn I think might bring us back to, again, this kind of recursive loop back to different cities. Because if we have the notion of an Occupy New York and an Occupy Portland having an influence on one another because of real time or perpetual now, then the pluralities of media and pluralities of times brings us back to plural cities. So that would be my observation, and with it, my first question is really what we can learn from these different kinds of occupies and different kinds of times, cities, and media. So I open that to everyone.
I'll just say one thing, which I think, I alluded to, but I think that it's a really interesting question about, you're saying, the relation between these. There've been historically ideas around the necessity for the communicability between struggles, right? There's kind of an argument, foregrounded by Hart and Negri of the incommunicability of struggles, right, that came out in their writing around empire. And then now we're kind of seeing the articulation of the communicability, right, the presence of the communicability of struggles. But I really enjoyed the first presentation because it's like, well, they're actually rough edges around that. It's not smooth at all. And so that these questions about the relation between the specificities of these different of these different spaces becomes really crucial, in addition to the kinds of inheritances. I was so glad you talked about Iran, because I was just thinking about, continual fetish of the novelty of Occupy continues to bother me because it's like they're inheritances of these forms of media, right? And then online and offline. So that was a few jumbled thoughts, but a response.
Certainly, I think there are publics forming in digital media that are indisputably more efficacious and real than the public discourses that happen in embodied venues. And you made that point in a way beautifully with your opening image of the city council meeting or whatever it is that's with the charts and graphs and no audience, a couple people snoozing in the front row. I think a little bit about some other examples. The way when we fly, we are physically moving through virtual space, as we were reminded when the FAA infrastructure is dialed back. We're reminded that we can only get in the plane in the air if our plane is moving through a virtual information system smoothly. And I think Google's project to create cars, to reimagine the car as a navigational device for a geo database, basically the car as a map reading tool, I think is another powerful demonstration. It's a little different from your point about publics, but it certainly reminds us that what we think of as physical spaces are also fundamentally virtual.
About whether social media is public space or just a tool, but I think it's closely related again to this term documentary that has come up, and also to some of the kind of hanging on questions around media, the specifics of media in their times and places, and that comes to the Rothstein's presentations around questions more elaborated in their paper, for instance, about the usefulness of something like Facebook or Twitter within a movement that may question the for-profit nature behind their creation. I'm paraphrasing you. I hope that that's fairly paraphrased. So you're smirking. I guess that's all right. And along with that, some of these other kinds of tools, surveillance, for instance, and other kinds of, for me, things that have a whiff of détournement. I was reminded in Jonathan and Brett's paper of this creation of a National Day of Civic Hacking, which has been mandated by the White House, no less than the White House. And it starts to question for me a little bit what the agency of these tools are as public space, whether in a democracy or a kind of self-proclaimed democracy, or created from private corporations. So I'm curious whether Adam and Rosalynn or any of you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, to touch back on the idea of like localization for a minute, I think that when I traveled around to other occupations in other cities, I would notice that the General Assembly was always done slightly differently. It was kind of the same model, but it always unfolded a little differently depending on where it is and the sort of history that they'd had with the process. And I think the same thing goes for the technological spaces that were used, whether it be social media, a Google Doc, or some other format, that each particular implementation of these technological spaces would sort of look differently, even if the tool was the same. So I wouldn't say that the tool necessarily determines what the space ends up looking like, even though they're closely related. I think there is some freedom there to have it move. That said, yeah, so social media certainly forms a space that is very different than a lot of other communication tools. You agree?
Sure, and I agree. And I guess this question of private and public spaces is interesting to me, because looking at these, and we do talk about this a little bit more in the paper that we wrote, I think we're often thinking of the narratives being created as being these multimodal narratives that cross boundaries. And so there's an in-person discussion, like a face-to-face discussion that's occurring in the camp. There's an extension of that goes into social media with a tweet or with a video that's being produced, and then that is reincorporated into the movement, and the discussion continues in that sort of space. So whether or not the social media is private or public, we are seeing those boundaries being crossed as the narrative moves from across multiple modes of communication. And so I think ultimately we can see that there are private and public spaces, but these boundaries are not set up in quite the way that we're used to thinking of them when we watch the process of how narrative occurs.
Okay.
I think the issues with public and private throughout the history of Occupy was like the central issue that I think was brought up, and there's no easy answer to say what the dynamic is between public and private. And I think that was something that we really discovered in the movement, was whether it's the legal status of Zuccotti Park, or who owns a Twitter stream, and whether that's that can be subpoenaable. There's just like a beehive worth of questions about public and private here.
Following on from Jordan's question, I'll try, and it's a bit challenging to have a question that kind of appeals to all presentations, that are quite diverse and very interesting, so thank you for that. I'm interested in the way that you all show examples of both digital innovation and spatial innovation in spatial practices and visual practices in all of those different cases and sites. And in a way, what strikes me is that they're all based in a way on romantic notion of how to provoke change. There is a bit of a bottleneck in that you raise awareness. Activism is there to make a case about a certain issue, but then there is this very tricky and challenging interface between the people on the one side and government or decision makers on the other side. And I'm wondering to what extent are there any examples of where we're actually making inroads into using, these spatial or digital kinds of new practices to not just raise awareness, but to actually connect and interface with decision makers on various levels of government. Because I think that a lot of these examples, it's about showing the data, being angry and showing the emotional side of things. But at the end of the day, we then rely on politicians and decision makers and policy makers listening to us, and to what extent is that based on a realistic notion or a romantic notion that goes back to the Greek art around how decision making and politics is actually made.
I think that's a great question, and even at the risk of lapsing again into romance, as I am wont to do, I would say that the thing that I most appreciated learning from Occupy Wall Street was to think of a different set of goals, which was not to influence the state, but to build, at however small and provisional a scale, to build relationships, a polity that bypassed both the state and the market. Of course, perfect autonomy is impossible, almost inconceivable, but I really appreciated learning to think that the goal might not be to seize control of state mechanisms or to succeed in the market, but to construct provisional quasi-autonomous spaces for different kinds of interaction.
I think Jens back there has his hand up, so we have time for just one last brief comment or question, please.
By the tools, I have to react. There is a lady Bernal, but also interesting quote by Einstein, who says that your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And this kind of applies for me here, because if you have tools like social media or digital media, I believe actually that the perception and the radius of communication is changed. And I really thank you for showing the results. If you take people away those possibilities, in which way they become creative and look for other ways. In that way, I really believe there is an influence of social media in the public domain, because you had those tools and you had those chances and you know about the possibilities you have with them. I agree with the also negative side of that communication. But I believe they would have never stood on the rooftops without having social media before. Because that's somehow what changed. The tool has an influence. Not only a tool, but
Okay, well, I can see we're already up to our ears in a very rich discussion, and I really want to thank all of our presenters, maybe particularly Adam and Rosalynn, who, despite technical difficulties and distance, really opened up our entire conference for us. But to Tarane, Paige, and Jonathan, thank you so much. Really fantastic presentations.